Right, so objective 4 of the advertising management lecture is about the importance of setting advertising objectives. So if you recall, once again, one of the earlier sub-lectures, we talked about the accountability of advertising in terms of, if you invest the same amount of money you were to invest in advertising into something like a bank term deposit, then the accountability of what you get back is very obvious, right? You put in X amount, you multiply that by the interest, and that's what you get back at the end of the year. Whereas with advertising, the accountability is a little bit more ambiguous, and so you don't know if you invest the same amount as you would in a term deposit, exactly how much of that would you get back? You might lose some of it, or even if you break even, was that really worth your time? So objectives are a really important thing to consider when you launch an advertising campaign. Or when you try to justify obtaining some sort of budget to spend on your advertising ideas. So in this lecture, we're going to look at advertising objectives and why they are important. So the first reason why is that having these objectives really force marketing managers and the advertising agencies to kind of reach a consensus. So they have to agree on exactly, what they're trying to achieve when they launch this advertising campaign. So within your own group projects that we're doing for Zuru Edge, you'll also note that there have been some objectives that have already been written into the client brief. So these are essentially what Zuru Edge as the client would like you as the pseudo ad agency to try to help them achieve if they were to implement your proposed campaign. So this is the campaign that you in your little groups will pitch back to them. The second reason why advertising objectives are really important is that once you've established, what you're trying to achieve, this provides a really useful roadmap or guideline in terms of, okay, well, if these are our objectives, then what type of budget do we need, and what type of message will we convey, and what type of media are we going to select? So it really sets out the blueprint by which you run your advertising campaign. And the final reason is that it sets these goals so that your ad campaigns can be evaluated in some way, right? Otherwise, so this goes back to accountability. You're spending all this money. How do we know whether it was worth it or not? We don't know unless you're measuring something that would indicate that you've achieved your goals and therefore justify the spending. So what are some criteria for successful advertising objectives? The first thing is actually three things. So that's who you're speaking to. This is the audience or the target market. What you're going to say. So this is the message, the compelling message that you're trying to put forward to your audience. And when is all this going to happen? And that takes the form of some date range or a timeline. The second criteria is that these objectives you're trying to achieve should be quantifiable and measurable. So you all know about SMART goals, right? Specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. So that's another very important thing to incorporate into your advertising objectives. That could be in the form of brand awareness, so moving it from a certain level of brand awareness to a new level, or it could be something even more tangible such as sales. The third criteria is to specify the amount of change. So for instance, if you're talking about a pre-sales objective such as brand awareness, then that could be something from moving zero awareness up to a certain percentage. So some of the brands that you're working for with Zuru Edge are new brands, so they have essentially zero awareness. So that's a very, simple baseline to go from. Other existing brands will already have a certain level of brand awareness, and so then it's up to you to establish what the existing level is in order to move it to another realistic level, or they may have research on what their existing brand awareness level is. Similarly, if you go for a more hard, sort of tangible objective such as sales, then you want to have some sort of baseline of current units sold and move that onto your new number of units sold by the end of your campaign. The fourth criteria is that these objectives should be realistic. So some of the objectives that have that Zuru have come up with within your client brief are obviously realistic because they set them for you. So they are within the capability of the company. So this kind of relates to the fifth criteria, which is whatever ad objectives you have, they should theoretically be internally consistent with the other factors within the company. So that sounds a bit complicated, so let me break it down this way. It wouldn't make sense for Zuru to give you an objective of increasing their sales of, let's say, toilet paper by, 1 million units if they cannot produce 1 million units. Right, and that sounds kind of common sense. Why would you set an objective on the one hand that is so ambitious, but on the other hand not be able to meet that criteria? But it does happen in the real world sometimes where ad objectives are not in line with business or corporate objectives. So one example I have, which I won't name the company, but it was a sub-product for a carpet manufacturer, and this sub-product was a carpet cleaning product. So the ad objectives for the carpet cleaning product from that division of the carpet manufacturing as a whole, they wanted to increase the sales of carpet cleaners, right? Because that was their baby, so to speak. On the other hand, the corporate objectives within that very same company was not really in line with increasing the sales of carpet cleaning. It was more about moving into other flooring solutions, such as tiles and hardwood laminates, vinyl, etc. Because the trends globally were moving away from carpet and towards hard floor surfaces. And so you can see there how on the one hand we got a project to increase the sales of a carpet cleaning agent, but on the other hand this was not internally consistent with the corporate objectives. So with the three objectives, the three briefs that we have from Zuru Edge, you would hope that they're realistic and they're internally consistent with what the company is capable of producing. And finally, these objectives should be clearly written. So if we look at those 6 criteria, I'd invite you to pause the video now and go onto our Canvas teaching platform and open up any one of the briefs that you and your team have decided to work on, whether that's me, Earth Initiative, or Health by Habit. Have a look at those client briefs and you'll see that hopefully they've covered these 6 criteria for successful advertising objectives. They definitely tell you who you're communicating with in terms of providing those consumer personas. They tell you what you should be saying because they have these key messages. They tell you when you should be doing all this. There are timeline parameters. They give you some very specific and quantifiable objectives in terms of number of units sold, but it is also up to you to a certain extent to introduce new objectives if you think that they would help achieve the objectives that they've set. So for instance, they mention brand awareness as a topic that they're interested in increasing as an objective, but they don't give you a specific amount of change, probably because there currently is no brand awareness for some of those brands. But it's up to you to decide what is a realistic increase in brand awareness given the budget that you've been allocated. We've mentioned that they are realistic and internally consistent with the company, and the briefs, from what I can gather, are fairly clearly written. So here's another example of ad objectives. This is based on a Head & Shoulders product called Backstage Shampoo, and we've just broken these up into 5 different advertising objectives. And they start off at the very top with something like brand awareness. So you'll see there objective 1 looks at creating awareness among 90% of the target audience, and then it explains a little bit about how you're going to do that. Objective 2 is about creating interest among 70%. So a couple of things I want you to notice as I go through the slide is the objectives change in terms of, I guess, the level of difficulty or level of commitment requested by the target audience, and the percentage of the audience decreases. And I'll explain a little bit about what's happening there. So the third objective is to create positive feelings, right, as well as preference. So now we're going from mere awareness, which is just knowing about the brand, to actually feeling some sort of positive emotion towards the brand and even preferring the brand over and above the existing competing shampoo products. Objective 4 might be something like obtain trial. So this is a sales objective now. We're talking about getting people to try this product. And you'll notice the percentage there drops to 20%. And the final objective is regular use. So this is, I guess the big prize to be won when you're launching these advertising campaigns. If you can get people to regularly use your product, then you've established what is one form of brand loyalty, which is the golden goose of marketing, right? If you can launch a campaign that gets people to use your product over and over again, then it's definitely paying for itself. So those objectives have been set out in this way because they help explain the next theoretical concept I'm going to go into. The communications effects pyramid is based on starting at the very bottom of the pyramid with something like awareness, which is fairly simple to achieve. You just need to get people to notice your brand. And we've got an arbitrary number there, 90%. So these percentages they're not factual. They're just a way of illustrating how the communication effects pyramid works. So 90% awareness. Then when we move up a level, so beyond just getting people to be aware of your brand, if you want them to know something about your brand, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. Hence that percentage is smaller because it's easier to get people, 90% of people to be aware of your brand, but it's very difficult to get that same number, 90%, to know something about your brand. And so realistically, as if you're setting an objective, that number has to be smaller. Likewise, if we keep going up this communication effects pyramid, we see that the next level up from knowing something is liking your brand, right? So not just being aware of your brand, knowing something about your brand, and now liking your brand. So once again, if you spend the same amount of money, for that amount of money, you might get 90% of your target market to be aware of your brand. That same amount of money may only be able to achieve 40% liking of your brand within that same target market, because that's a lot harder to get someone to do, right? To like your brand. Moving up further, then we see preference. It's even harder to get people to prefer your brand compared to your competitors. Even beyond that, trial. So now we're hitting those sales objectives. Trial meaning actually buying your product and trying it out. And so that percentage decreases once again. And at the very top was that objective 5 in the previous slide, and that was regular use. And you see that's a very small percentage. So as I mentioned before, those percentages are arbitrary. They're not set in stone. They're not set based on any sort of scientific research. But from a logical and a rational point of view, we could say that objectives at the top of the pyramid are obviously harder to accomplish, right? Because that makes sense. If I had $2 million to spend on advertising, I could spend that money and get 90% awareness. I'm not going to get 90% regular use, right? Because that would be crazy. For that same amount of money, I might be able to get 5% regular use, right? And then that really depends on the type of product it is, how well targeted my ad campaign is, if there are other elements that I'm throwing into the mix, such as sales promotions or personal selling, etc. So within the integrated marketing communications framework, there's a whole bunch of different things I can do for the money that I get in order to try and hit any one of those objectives on the communications effects pyramid. So the main point of this slide is to basically show you that, because it's very hard to get people to buy your product, you have to be realistic when you set those objectives. On the other hand, it's relatively easy to get people to know about your product. And so you can, get a lot more people aware of your product for the same amount of money than it takes to get a percentage of people to buy your product. But in terms of objectives that the clients are interested in, obviously the top of the pyramid is better, right? They don't really care how many people are aware of the brand. They actually want people to buy their brand regularly, because that is what rings the till, which is a saying in industry. That's what brings the money in. However, you need people to be aware of your brand in the first place in order for them to move up the chain and know something about your brand, like your brand, develop a preference for your brand, try the brand for the first time, and then continue using your brand. And that's how you move people up. And advertising has a role to play in every single one of those steps.